Thank you for tuning into this video about Iranian policy-making institutions and government. I would always like to say that Iran probably has the most complex government. Look at the diagram here, and in fact, print out this diagram if you need it. This diagram tells you a whole lot about checks and balances and control. It shows you how people get into power. It shows you that a lot of the Iranian government the power does come from the people, from the electorate, that does get some say in the government. It also is a good example of the theocratic elements and the republic elements. You have theocratic elements kind of in the circles around the supreme leader, and you have the republican elements kind of over on the right, getting more electorate involvement in them. So let's just dive in. Let's get started here, and we'll come back to that diagram if we need to. We have some theocratic institutions. We have a country that is very centralized, that has a unitary state. It does use provinces and districts and sub-districts just for elections and for making it easy to manage, kind of like China. China has a unitary state, and Iran has a unitary state. Both of them have unitary states to control the populace. They're both in pretty large, territories, but they both break it up into provinces and districts to make it easier to manage. So they want to make it easier to manage so they can control the populace if they need to. Now, this country does have a dual executive. I wouldn't call it semi-presidential, and I wouldn't call it a presidential system. It's its own hybrid. It's its own thing. The dual executive has a supreme leader and a president in those kind of two executive roles, although you'll find out that one of them has certainly more power than the other. It does have a unicameral legislature, although there is an institution that does check that unicameral legislature. So it kind of has unicameral on paper, bicameral in function. And they have a judiciary that's definitely not independent, but is solely based on Sharia law. Let's dive in. So here we can look at this. We're going to start with the left side with how the supreme leader comes to be, because that's where a lot of the power is. So let's look at this. Here's the supreme leader. There he is. Supreme leader is extremely powerful. The supreme leader is chosen by a group of clerics called the Assembly of Experts. Now, if I go back a slide, you will see that the people choose the Assembly of Experts. So the Assembly of Experts is a group of clerics. They're elected by the voters, and those experts get to choose the supreme leader. Now, they only choose the supreme leader when the supreme leader dies. But they can theoretically remove the supreme leader if the supreme leader was seen as unfit to be in that position, which has never happened. We've only had 2 supreme leaders in Iran. Now, the supreme leader's goal is to basically be the top interpreter of Islamic law, of Sharia law. So they're the one that gets to interpret things at its highest. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have more powers. Because the supreme leader can have a say in who the presidential candidates are. The supreme leader can dismiss the president. The supreme leader can dismiss the guardian council, which you'll find is a pretty powerful institution. Supreme leader is the commander-in-chief. The supreme leader can issue a decree for a national referendum. So if they really want a policy, they can push it out there with a decree to have a national vote on something. Which is one of the first actions that the first Ayatollah Khomeini did, was to have a referendum on the new regime. Of course, the supreme leader can also appoint people. He appoints the judiciary, the head of the judiciary. The supreme leader appoints half of the members of the guardian council, which once again I said was a pretty important, prominent institution. So he's having some say in other positions in government. He also gets to appoint the prayer leaders and heads of the radio and television. This is giving him more influence over the people, which in turn gives him more influence over the kind of elected half of the government. Also allows for him to, censor things if needed. Here is the election of the current supreme leader. As I mentioned before, when the Supreme Leader dies, they have an election like this. The 86 members of the Assembly of Experts can choose a new Supreme Leader. Here you see Supreme Leader Khamenei elected in the back in 1989 on the bottom here, which means he's served for over 30 years at this point. Now, I already mentioned the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council is certainly an important position. It's an important theocratic element of the Iranian government. You already know that 6 of their members are chosen by the Supreme Leader. It's a 12-member council. 6 of them are clerics that are chosen right from the Supreme Leader, so he can choose his most trusted allies to go here. And the other 6 are lawyers that are recommended by the head of Judiciary and approved by the Parliament. So, let's think about this for a moment. 6 are chosen by the Supreme Leader, and 6 are lawyers recommended by the head of Judiciary. And the head of Judiciary is chosen by the Supreme Leader. So the Supreme Leader has indirectly the ability to really name the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council's job is twofold. They can veto legislation, so the president doesn't veto things, the Guardian Council can. They veto legislation based on Sharia law, on Islam. They can also determine who cannot run for office. So let's say you want to run for the Majles, the parliament in Iran. You put your name into the hat that's saying you're running, and the Guardian Council could say, we don't like the qualifications you have. And they can make you take assessments having to do with your ethics, having to do with your understanding of Sharia law, and make you answer those questions. And if you don't fit the requirements, they can knock you out of your ability to run. So indirectly, the Guardian Council can kind of choose who runs for the Assembly of Religious Experts. And the Assembly of Religious Experts chooses the Supreme Leader. And the Supreme Leader chooses the Guardian Council. Hopefully you're kind of seeing a cycle here. The Guardian Council's powers are very, very powerful. Vetoing and vetting out candidates can affect the entire, election system. Which, by the way, the election system is immensely fast. The Guardian Council posts the final ballot, and you have essentially a week to campaign, and then the election day happens. Let's move forward to the Assembly of Religious Experts. So it's another, theocratic element of Iranian's government. I've already mentioned them numerous times already. They are a group of clerics that choose the Supreme Leader. And they do have the right to dismiss the Supreme Leader. They just never have done this. Now, this is an important position to be elected into because at some point the Supreme Leader is going to possibly need replacing. The last election, which I believe was in '96, there was a lot of hype about getting out to vote for it because the Supreme Leader is getting old and he may retire or die sometime in in a couple years. And that would mean that the Assembly of Religious Experts elected in 1996 could be very, very influential in choosing the direction that the country is going to go. Here's a great example of vetting. Look in 2016. 801 people registered to run for the Assembly of Experts. So 801 clerics registered to run, and only 166 qualified. So that means a lot of other clerics were weeded out of the bunch, narrowed down. Last thing I'd mention, there is an expediency council. It doesn't come up a lot from the AP. It does have a lot of folks appointed by the Supreme Leader, and their whole goal is to settle disputes between the Legislature, the Majles, and the Guardian Council. They try to speed things up. They're the expediency council. That's their goal. Now, seeing as the Supreme Leader has so much power, it's not a surprise that the president is relatively weak. The president is the head of government, does get to serve out potentially up to two 4-year terms, is elected by the people, but doesn't have a whole lot of power. Of course, the candidates running for president are, they're approved by the Guardian Council. This does weed out anyone that is a woman, anyone that doesn't fit the requirements. This does weed out, or it did weed out, Ahmadinejad in his second attempt at running for president again, after he waited 4 years of not being president. So it does potentially, weed out some, or vet out some potential candidates. The president is elected by absolute majority. Hopefully you remember what absolute majority means. That means there's potential of a runoff. Of course, the campaign for president only takes a week, and then the runoff campaign takes a week as well. Here is the 2013 election, so you can see Rouhani's, not recent election, but the election before that. Now, let's look at some qualifications for the president. The president must be Shia, the president must be between 25 and 75, and the president must be a well-known personality. This means someone that's been in politics, someone that is influential, and typically this rules out the women, according to the Guardian Council at least. They would argue that they can't be a well-known personality. Now, the president doesn't have a whole lot of powers anyways. It gets to choose vice presidents, which are kind of like the Secretary of State and Secretary of Education and Secretary of Energy. They're in charge of different departments. The president gets to come up with a budget and can present legislation to the parliament. The president gets to sign things. The key is sign. The president does not veto. The Guardian Council is the vetoing body of the Iranian government. And the president, of course, is in charge of some national security issues, and the president gets to be very involved with local government. I'd probably say the biggest powers of the president in Iran are controlling bureaucracy and controlling some of the local government, town mayors, governors, that kind of stuff. In fact, bureaucracy, gives him a lot of power because the Iranian regime does have control over things like a lot of nationalized industries, has control over, intelligence divisions, just like the CIA, has control over, Islamic social law for proper conduct in public life. So, Iranian president, I always say, is pretty weak in the big scheme of things. Even in Iran, if we look at all the political institutions, the president tends to be not very influential. Now, the Majles, let's look at the legislature of Iran. It is a first past the post system that does actually reserve some seats. There are seats reserved for religious minorities. Iran values religious minorities as far as Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. They understand that these groups would probably not get chosen as far as the Guardian Council vetting out candidates, and they would probably not get chosen by the people because they are such a small chunk of the population. So Iran includes these minorities to make sure that their viewpoints are heard in the legislature. Now, as far as elections, they are elected in multi-member districts, so there are multiple candidate positions in each district, depending on the population size. Here you can see the Majles makeup. You can see there's women in the Majles. You can see there's clerics in the Majles. You can see there's a lot of non-clerics. And you can see the 5 reserved seats for the religious minorities. Now, the Majles has some qualifications as well. They have age minimums and age maximums. They once again have to have the Guardian Council vet their candidates. And what I always find interesting is if you're running for the first time for the Majles, you have to have a university degree. So you have an interesting requirement to be in the legislature of an education. Now, the Majles is kind of like other legislatures, as in it gets to approve appointments. It can remove appointments, though. It can approve budgets. It can approve treaties. It gets to approve 6 of the appointments to the Guardian Council, and it just enacts laws. And In function, the Majles doesn't work like a rubber stamp. This is nothing like China. It functions as an actual legislative body, but this legislative body does, it does get checked by the Guardian Council in many ways. Iran's judiciary, quite simply, is not very independent. It is definitely controlled by the Supreme Leader. Supreme Leader, of course, is the ultimate interpreter of Sharia law. So here you have the judiciary. It's their job to make sure that Sharia law is above all laws passed by the Majlis. So they can rule stuff unconstitutional if it violates Sharia law, if it violates the Quran or Islamic law. The Supreme Leader, of course, gets to appoint who the senior judges are, so he has a lot of influence in the judicial system, making them not independent. They are dependent on the Supreme Leader. Some other things to note, that the punishment system in Iran is very strict, very harsh. The death penalty is used for a lot of different crimes like adultery and homosexuality and drinking habitually. Oftentimes it's repeat offenses that result in the death penalty, but it does happen very often in Iran. Hundreds of people are executed every year. Also, as far as the judicial system, they do tend to value evidence presented by men over women. So you do have another discrepancy between how men and women are treated in the Iranian government. Iran does have a very large military. It is kind of most known for its Revolutionary Guard, which is kind of their active troops. It is their kind of like Marines. It's their more elite forces. They do tend to go off and get involved in other countries. The Revolutionary Guard fought in Syria. The Revolutionary Guard was very active in Iraq, as far as right now trying to kind of build an allegiance with Iraq. So you do see them involved in other countries. The Revolutionary Guard also has a Basij force, which is a voluntary paramilitary force, and that force works back in the country on domestic affairs. So people can get involved with domestic policing of the country and enforcing cultural laws and putting down protests in the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard also controls a huge chunk of the economy. So the Revolutionary Guard has some industries that it has taken over, which is not uncommon in Iran that you see institutions taking over industries, because you see that with the bonyads as well. In Iran, they have such a value of charitable foundations, like the Martyrs Foundation that takes care of fallen soldiers' families, or the Foundation for the Oppressed and Disabled. These are organizations that initially existed before the revolution. They existed to help people out, to help the misfortunate or unfortunate. But today they're given a lot of tax benefits. Today they're given a lot of financial support and organization from the actual government, and they're even given the ability to monopolize certain industries to make more money, and then in essence help out to different groups of people. So when you wonder why Iran is very popular with peasants and very popular with the lower middle class, a big part of that is the regime is pretty helpful to a lot of different types of people. So why wouldn't they be potentially popular with those groups of people? And here you have charitable foundations that act like almost bureaucratic entities or nationalized industries in many ways. As far as political parties, we're not going to touch on that too much. Political parties, in all essence, are kind of like temporary labels. They're not really powerful institutions, and they don't really stick around for very long. They're more so coalitions of conservatives versus reformers. They do have interest groups in Iran. They do have unions in Iran for some people, like factory workers, but they're not very powerful, and the Iranian government does require registering and monitoring of those groups. Media There is some independent media, but predominantly the media in Iran is controlled via the supreme leader. So a lot of the radio and television is monitored. A lot of it is under control and certainly biased for the regime, and this creates potential problems for the freedom of information. In fact, Iran has worked really hard to crack down on social media. A lot of social media giants have been restricted in Iran. Now, the Iranian people have tried to get around that by using different internet programs to still access things like Instagram and Facebook, which may not be legal to access, but Iran's trying their best to lock that stuff down. And Iran's doing their best to monitor the media so they can, take action where they need to take action as well. That's all for now as far as the political institutions of Iran. Thank you for listening in.